Hello. Today we're going to talk about a very contemporary type of literature, the literature of postmodernism and metamodernalism, namely the novel written by the British writer Alice Smith. Postmodernism and metamodernism, as I've said, are extremely contemporary, modern styles of literature, styles and movements, philosophies, and so on. Postmodernism appeared in the second half of the 20th century, while metamodernism is said to be, it is claimed as one of the variants of what is going on in literature and also in the culture of the world as a whole, as well as politics, social state of the world, and even economy. So, talking about postmodernism, after the two world wars in the first half of the 20th century, the world had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Clearly, the pre-war political systems were not working. Technology and progress were not sufficient solutions to the political and economical problems. This is when a lot of major international organizations appeared. For example, the UN, the United Nations, that was established in 1945, the European Union, officially established in 1993, but the process commenced in 1948. NATO, that was established in 1949, World Trade Organization, and so on. Postmodernism began in Europe in the 1950s. Some scholars say that we still live in the epoch of postmodernism. Some call it what we have now, post-postmodernism. Some use other terms that we will discuss later. Some people believe that the novel called Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, one of the biggest modernist writers and one of the most influential figures in the world literature of the 20th century, is one of the first postmodernist novels. For example, Umberto Eco claims that Finnegan's Wake is not a modernist, but a postmodern work of literature. Of course, the rise of postmodernism had a lot to do with the crisis of modernism. It was thought that modernism is difficult to understand for the masses, and literature, as well as art in general, is not the property of the elites. The elite, high art, should connect with mass culture, mass art. Literature should make use of the mass entertainment tools, utilize the mechanisms of entertainment genres like detective, western, erotic novel, parody, and so on. Postmodernism can be seen as a historical phenomenon, a natural stage of cultural development of the world. However, by some, it is also seen as a trans-historical phenomenon, meaning that it is a typical and typically last stage of any epoch's evolution. Any era has its own postmodernism of sorts. For example, the aforementioned Umberto Eco thought of Lawrence Sterne, a British sentimentalist of the second half of the 18th century, a postmodernist of his own time. Postmodernism is when the epoch starts to defy its own self, reject itself and laugh at itself. When there is nothing to defy, when the only way is to be ironic about what has just perished into nothingness. If you think about it, Sterne really does suit here. A lot of thinkers, for example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, thought of postmodernism as the time when all values are destroyed and nothing is left of them. Neo-Marxists thought of it as the time of extreme consumerism and conformism. Postmodernism takes its root in the USA. This is where it was most organized. The UK experienced a lot of it too. The USA was a young, progressive, quickly changing, flexible, dynamic country in the second half of the 20th century. And it still remains a lot of that to this day. So the country was trying to see itself as a United States, not as a melting pot, but as a salad of sorts. If we take a look at what postmodernism actually looked like and felt like, there are several features of it for us to consider. First of all, there is no single truth that is truer than any other truths or opinions. Pluralism is radicalized. The world is endless, so endless is the amount of possible interpretations of the same event. There is no such thing as final, set definition of anything whatsoever that everyone should agree with. Nothing is finite, nothing is carved in stone. The final interpretation depends on the interpreter, reader, listener, beholder, which answers to the concept of the death of the author that was put forward by Roland Barthes. There are no canons to follow in the creation of literature or art in general. There are no hierarchies of values. No one can tell you what to value or how to do what you do. The lines between the good and the evil, between life and death, are essentially blurred. There are no clear definitions and limits between the genres. They get mixed, intertwined. It is sometimes difficult to tell one from the other. Take, again, Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose as an example. There is also a fragmental character of narration of a story. There is no such thing as incompatibility anymore. Anything goes with anything. Postmodernists take up deconstruction. It doesn't necessarily mean destruction. It means creating a new unity out of the fragments of the old one, although those pieces of the old reality may seem incompatible at first sight. We cannot really create anything drastically new, according to postmodernists. Hence the concepts of intertext by Christopher, that in its turn is based on the concept of dialogue by Mikhail Bakhtin. Everything has been said, but there is still a lot to think about. Our goal is to find something new in what has already been said. There is no such thing as the author as he is or she is. Any text is a field of potential sense, point, meaning that should be created not by the author but by the reader. Where is the author? If I'm reading it, it's being written. Irony is one of the tools to thinking in a new way about what has been previously said. Postmodernism is pretty ironic, not just about the epochs that came before, but about postmodernist itself too. Postmodernism is also about language games, about games in general. Game is the foundation of the multi-level character of text. Multilingualism, puns, wordplay, references, and allusions are all part of the game, as well as the emergence of a relatively new type of the narrator, who is an unreliable narrator, someone we can't really fully trust, someone who may deceive us on purpose, or may just omit some details of his or her narration because they've just forgotten what things are. Anthropological pessimism is one of the features of postmodernist fiction and culture too. Human is seen as a genius jerk. Postmodernism varies from nationality to nationality. During the 1960s and 1980s, postmodernism was rather general. There were no differences between it, say in the US and in England. Specifications started later. For example, in the UK, postmodernist writers used popular literary genres and had a particular interest in their own features, natural history, to the form of classical English novel. There was a tendency towards realism. Postmodern is in the form, not in the content. The content is not much of concern for the postmodernist authors of the UK. The genres of literary postmodernism in Britain include, for example, philosophical fiction by Golding and Murdoch, neo-Victorian fiction that plays with the very prominent Victorian values of the 19th century by Antonia Susan Byers, Graham Swift, Ian McEwan, Julian Barnes. That also included meta-historical fiction, meta here meaning one more layer of reflection, pondering over history, over what it actually is, not just turning to the event of the past and historical figures as plot tools, etc. It's history of history, history about history. Another very important genre of literary postmodernism is post-colonial fiction. We do remember that by the 1950s, Britain as an empire virtually ceased to exist, although it still remained formally an empire up until the 1990s, when it lost its last colony in Hong Kong to China. The most prolific writers here are Hadith Qureshi, Zadie Smith, and a lot of others. They reflect on the interconnections between different cultures and literatures, especially the cultures of the former British colonies, and the way the British imperialism influenced them, the questions of racism, gender identification, and any other type of identification. Of course, there's meta-literature and meta-narrative, about which we're going to talk about right now. The presence of postmodernism in modern-day culture and philosophy has been argued since as early as the 1980s. At the turn of the 21st century, different philosophical manifestos started to appear in an attempt to give cultural studies a new language, a new updated vocabulary to use. New scholars began proclaiming that we now live at the age of neo-modernism or remodernism or postmodernism, digimodernism, pseudo, alter, metamodernism, and so on. All these new isms are various and numerous. Later, in the 2010s, the term metamodernism appeared. Metamodernism has never been seen, though, as an alternative to postmodernism, but as one of the ambitious concepts of contemporary culture. The term is now becoming more and more widely used, developed, and thought about. It is especially popular among the Russian-speaking scholars. Metamodernism, of course, takes postmodernism and arguably post-postmodernism as its basis. Obviously, the new concept causes a lot of argument and undoubtedly needs further improvement. Among the main principles of metamodernism are, first of all, oscillation or wavering between the postmodernism and modernism tendencies. The pendulum between those two is in constant movement. The notion of metaxis, or in-betweenness, introduced by the Greek philosopher Plato, is in the center of metamodernism. This oscillation occurs between the postmodernist irony that includes nihilism, sarcasm, distrust, and often melancholy, and the modernist enthusiasm that includes hope, belief, and sincerity, which together comprise the such notions of metamodernism as new sincerity and post-irony. It also swings between the postmodernist detachment and commitment that belongs to sort of modernist writers and just cultural intellectuals. It also swings between the postmodern dystopism and relative modern or modernist utopism. Epistemologically, metamodernism is paralleled to postmodern and modernism. It exists sort of together with them. It does not necessarily defy them entirely. Ontologically, it exists between them, and chronologically, it follows the two, appears beyond both. This is another manifestation of the metamodernist pendulum, wavering, swinging between postmodernism and modernism. The concept of movement is generally central to metamodernism. This oscillation that I've been talking about is more of a both-neither trend, not sort of like a mathematical summary of the two tendencies. Neither does it presuppose the harmony or balance of both. Metamodernism wavers, swings between the two opposites. Reaching closely to one, it immediately swings back to the other. The concept of metamodernism has been criticized for probably not comprising all of the phenomena of modern culture, not even the majority of them. It has been argued that metamodernist scholars narrow down the very notion of culture, diminishing it to a small set of aesthetic phenomena. But still, to some, it feels like the concept of metamodernism is one of the most interesting and livable among the contemporary cultural theories. Metamodernism is, of course, an attribute of a whole lot of different artistic media. Among modernist artworks, scholars name the films by Wes Anderson, Miranda July, and Spike Jonze, the music by Arcade Fire and Bill Callahan, TV shows from Parks and Recreation to Breaking Bad, and literature by David Foster Wallace and Zadie Smith, who we have already mentioned as a postmodern writer, but I think it's fair to say that the majority of contemporary writers sort of exist on the verge between two different epochs. One more writer that by some is considered metamodernist is a Scottish author, Ali Smith. One of the latest works of the prolific writer is the so-called Seasonal Quartet, comprising 4 novels that were written and published almost as the in real-life events were unraveling over the span of about 5 years, starting with Brexit. In 2016, Brexit, we do remember, is the process of Great Britain splitting from the European Union, which caused quite a division within the country, but didn't seem quite a problem to the European Union itself. The 4 novels, Autumn, Winter, Spring, and Summer, deal with a whole variety of topics that seem to bother modern / Western world: politics, ecology, division, polarization. All these novels seem to employ a more or less stable set of characters, whose fates intertwine in the most unexpected ways at times, and a more or less similar, ever-continuing set of themes and motives. Time, truth, history, responsibility, death, art, politics, ecology, borders, and togetherness are among those themes and motives. The quartet, first and foremost, revolves around its own circular form. Seasons end and come back inevitably again and again, similar but always changing. Life becomes death and vice versa. Young becomes old and vice versa. It's not even a vice versa thing most of the time, but again, the pendulum oscillation thing. The seasons also shift due to climate change, for example. Political turmoil alternates the borders of the countries, and, in all their absurdity, territorial borders create borders between people, but they also unite people, like the protesters in one of the Seasonal Quartet novels. The man-made shifts and limits and borders are sometimes seen as absurd and irrational. Rationality is togetherness to Alice Smith, but this rationality is not necessarily based on what the powers that be think is rational. This rationality might be rather subjective. We sometimes have to fight for this togetherness pretty violently, because this is the only way for the human being to survive. Smith's novels also employ a certain type of historicity. History here swings between personal and public through the notion of responsibility. Our personal histories, Smith seems to be saying, are closely intertwined. They compose the history of the world. Thus, as helpless and at times hopeless as we may feel, we are responsible for not just our own being, but the being of a person on the other end of the world, or even on the other end of the time. Time is the central concept in seasonal quartet. It is seen through the style employed by Smith. The grammatical forms used are at first glance rather puzzling. At times, we can clearly see that the narration is about the past events. She uses present or even future grammatical tenses. In opposition to that, a lot of present time action is wrapped in a more traditional past tense narration. This seems to be a sign of oscillation again, between each character's past and present and even future selves, between our common past and common present. The novel, any novel, is always about time, Smith has said in a number of interviews. Time is both relative, characters play with and deliberately shift the grammatical tenses and their own individual time, and very determinate. Some facts of history that inevitably affect the characters are real-life events that have their dates mentioned as well as their impact on the further generations. Hence the opposition and coexistence of young and old, and more generally, life and death. The very notion of a season presupposes constant change of old and new, old and young, living and dying on several occasions in our lives. And also just once in our own individual lives. The first novel of the seasonal quartet, Autumn, deals with two main characters, the young 30-something Elizabeth and the very old Daniel, who is in his hundreds. They meet when Elizabeth is a child, and Daniel is already quite an elderly person. But it is Elizabeth who is subjectively seen as some sort of an old soul. Her mother thinks of her as a child, naturally, but Elizabeth herself seems to see herself as a grown human. Daniel, who seems to still remember what being a child felt like, sort of teaches the little Elizabeth to play, to use imagination, and essentially to be as young as she actually is. Also, Daniel is on the verge. He himself is oscillating between life and death. At the beginning of the novel, he is in a coma, but his mind seems to still be working and providing him with dreamlike sequences of his own past and the world's present. Elizabeth visits him and talks to him and reads him books as if he could hear her, which both denies and establishes the upcoming death of Daniel's. Another exceptionally prominent theme in the quartet is, of course, the theme of the art and the artist. Art, according to Smith, is always relevant because it's political, because it should be political. Art is one of the highest forms of responsibility. An artist has to never shy away from the real and present, as well as the real and past. Art is also one of the greatest joys, because it creates connections between people. The novels of the quartet give Smith a platform that she uses to speak about the unspoken pioneers of art, especially women in art, that have been undeservedly forgotten, but whose imprint on culture cannot be erased. Those include, for example, sculptor Barbara Hepworth and artist Pauline Botti. Language is one of the important tools that plays a role in all of the cycle's novels. It is also one of the great means by people divided by political conflicts, natural, social, and cultural cataclysms, for people to find their way towards each other. One of the stylistic tools that Smith uses in her novels, especially in Autumn, is pun. This is not just a comical tool, although the motive of laughter is rather prominent as a connecting tool in Autumn, but a tool of bringing up the great connector of humans, understanding and doing something together. In order to laugh, you need to understand. In order to get together, you need to laugh together. Use the same vocabulary, the same texts, and remember to be ready to learn something new. Embrace the point of view of another person. This is exactly what Elizabeth and Daniel do in Autumn. If you take a look inside Smith's quartet, you will most likely be puzzled by the sheer look of the graphics, of the text at times. Dwelling between different media, connected with our usage of search engines like Google, social media like Twitter or now X, and so on, Smith plunges into the world of radical present that will, no doubt, soon become past. Seasonal Quartet is undoubtedly an experiment in time. We can see that at least partly this experiment is considered within the new realms of metamodernism, with its awareness of self, oscillation between various oppositions, that as kind of excluding each other as they are, still are able to coexist and kind of make the pendulum waver and swing between each other. Time, as usual, will tell us how to best address the epoch that we now live in. Maybe not in the nearest future, but definitely someday. So here are some of the thoughts on British and world postmodernism and metamodernism. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.